Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist? The History of the British Overseas Territories, Part 3. So this is the last episode talking about the British Overseas Territories. Just as a reminder, in Part 1 I talk about the territories of Montserrat, Anguilla, the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands, and the Cayman Islands. Then in the second episode I talked about Bermuda, St. Helena and its associated islands, the Falkland Islands, South Georgia and the Sandwich Islands, and the Antarctic Territory. In this episode we'll dive into the last four territories: Gibraltar, the bases of Akrotiri and Dhekelia, the British Indian Ocean Territory, and the Pitcairn Islands. While the first episode has a theme of Caribbean territories and the second episode was all about Atlantic territories, this episode doesn't really have a geographic theme between all four. They are all hot temperature-wise, but that's kind of where the similarities end. Gibraltar and the bases are located in the Caribbean, the Pitcairn Islands are located in the Southern Pacific, and the British Indian Ocean Territory, well, I'll just let you figure that one out. So let's go to our first territory, Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a peninsula connected to a peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, meaning it is surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, except for the north where it is connected to southern Spain. Gibraltar is the most populated of the territories we will talk about, with 34,000 people living there. Geographically, the territory is made up of a large limestone rock, known as the Rock of Gibraltar, and a thin coastline around it. Its location right at the entrance of the Mediterranean makes it a very important strategic location, something that will be very important in shaping the territory's history. Gibraltar would see many different peoples visit the territory in ancient and medieval times, but never really setting up any long-term settlements. This would change in the 8th century, when the Muslim Moors from North Africa invaded and set up a base in the territory. Successive Moorish dynasties would hold the territory from the 8th century until 1309, when the Catholic Spanish took the city in the First Siege of Gibraltar. The Spanish would hold the city until 1333, when the Moors retook the city in the Third Siege of Gibraltar. The Spanish would attempt several more sieges on the territory, until they were successful in the 8th Siege of Gibraltar in 1462. This would bring Gibraltar firmly under Spanish rule, removing the Muslims and Jews from the territory and forcefully converting those who stayed. The territory would serve as an important fortress against Spain's enemies, helping secure its southern coast. Several different battles would be fought in and around Gibraltar, such as sieges from rebellious nobles in 1467 and 1506, a raid from North African pirates in 1540, and two Dutch fleets engaging a Spanish fleet right outside the territory in 1607 and 1621. Spanish rule would come to an end in 1704. A combined Dutch and English fleet took the territory, hoping to use it as a base for further attacks into Spain during the War of Spanish Succession. This resulted in almost the entire population of the territory leaving, refusing to live under hostile rule. The remainder of the war would see Spain and her ally France try and fail to retake the territory in the 12th Siege of Gibraltar. When the war ended in 1713, Gibraltar was formally ceded to Britain in exchange for Spain and France not uniting. But the Spanish weren't really happy with this. They still saw Gibraltar as rightful Spanish land. I mean, it is connected directly to Spain. The Spanish would siege the territory in 1727, in the 13th siege to little success. The Spanish would try one more time to invade the territory during the American Revolutionary War in 1779. This final siege would be the most famous the territory has suffered through, earning it the title the Great Siege of Gibraltar. The small territory and its garrison of less than 10,000 men would suffer 3.5 years under siege from a Spanish and French force surrounding the territory. The Spaniards and French would come close at several points to taking the territory, but they were always beaten back. By war's end in 1783, the British had won the siege, and Gibraltar would never be sieged again by an enemy force. But Gibraltar's position as a military base wouldn't end after 1783. The British Navy had recognized its importance in the Mediterranean, and starting in the 19th century, built up the territory into an important fortress and naval base. Even today, Gibraltar still serves as the base for British military operations in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and North Africa. The fortress would see its population grow and change. Well, at first, British Gibraltar was mostly a mixture of Italians and Jews, who had stayed behind after the 1704 siege, along with British soldiers and officers. By the 19th century, more and more Spaniards would move into the territory, fleeing instability at home during the Napoleonic Wars and early 19th century. Portuguese, Italians, and Maltese people also began moving in large numbers looking for work. During World War II, the territory was never really under siege, but it did find itself under threat from Axis forces. Most of the civilian population of the territory was evacuated in 1940 due to fears of an Italian, Vichy French, German, or even possibly Spanish invasion. Gibraltar would several times be bombed, raided, or sabotaged by Axis forces, but they never made any serious attempts to invade the territory. This was due to the British largely dominating the Mediterranean Sea by 1942, the Axis failing to take other British-held territories in the area, such as Malta or Egypt, and just the strength of the British fortress in Gibraltar. By 1944, the war in the Mediterranean had been won, and the civilian population of the island returned. Post-war, the economy of the territory would begin to move away from solely supporting the military base, and into tourism and financial services. Gibraltar would also begin to see self-rule, as political parties and elections began being held in the territory. Today, there are currently two main political factions present in Gibraltar. The first faction is the Socialist Labour-Liberal Alliance, with the Socialist Labour Party and the Liberal Party working together to form a left-leaning government. The second faction are the Gibraltar Social Democrats, who are conservative. Now you may be thinking, what does Spain think about this military base right on its southern border? And well, the Spanish aren't really huge fans. While in several treaties in the 18th century, Spain had agreed that Gibraltar was under British sovereignty, many Spanish people and politicians don't really agree with this, and see the British as maintaining a military occupation of rightful Spanish land. Since the 50s, the Spanish government has been arguing for Gibraltar to be returned to Spanish control, or at least for the territory to be given joint administration by both the Spanish and British governments. The British government has rejected this argument, arguing that Gibraltar should remain under its sphere of influence. A referendum in 1967 and in 2002 both rejected Spanish rule over the territory, with over 95% voting against Spanish rule. However, Brexit has made things quite complicated for Gibraltar. In the referendum, 96% of the population voted for Britain to remain in the European Union, due to the fact that the territory's economy relies on easy access to the European market. However, since most of the UK voted to leave, it began the long process of negotiations between the government of Gibraltar, the UK, Spain, and the EU. Gibraltar left the EU in 2020, but currently is under a special trade agreement. It seems like the economy is doing okay for right now, but it may be too early to tell, and uncertainty is still very much present. So that will end our talk on Gibraltar, and we will now go to the sovereign bases of Akrotiri and Dhekelia. The bases are located on the island of Cyprus, in the eastern Mediterranean, with the two bases being separated from each other, but both on the southern side of the island. Akrotiri is the western base, and Dhekelia is the eastern base. The population of the bases is split between the British and Cypriot population. There are 7,000 British people living in the bases, serving as either administrators in the British military, or as family members of those administrators or military members. There's also another 11,000 Greek and Turkish Cypriots who live in the territory. Now, I know this is a history of these territories, but I'm going to skip a lot of the history of the bases, just because I'll talk about it in the Cyprus episode, and understanding the nature of the bases really starts at British colonialism. British colonialism would begin in 1878, when the British took over the island from the Ottomans. They used the island as a military base, protecting its geopolitical interests in Egypt and the Middle East. As Britain was negotiating with the Greek Cypriots for independence, it was agreed that Cyprus could have independence, but only if Britain could keep its Air Force base at Akrotiri and its military listening outpost at Dhekelia. This was agreed upon, although even today the decision is a bit controversial. The Greek Cypriot government today disputes the British sovereignty over the bases, arguing that the bases serve as colonial holdouts. While the Cypriot government today is far more focused on the Turkish holdings on the island, rather than the British bases, it is something in the back of the mind of the Cypriot government. One other thing I do want to mention is that the bases don't really hold any border security, except around the actual military installations and on the border with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. This means it's pretty easy for Greek Cypriots to both leave and enter the territory at will. In case you're wondering what's the deal with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, we really don't have time to get into it, so let's just move on. We move away from the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean, with the British Indian Ocean Territory. The Indian Ocean Territory is made up of the small islands that compose the Chagos Archipelago. In terms of neighboring countries, there is the Maldives to the north, the Seychelles to the west, Mauritius to the southwest, and Indonesia to the far east. The Chagos Archipelago was never settled for most of human history, but it seems that humans had set foot in the region and knew of it at least before the 18th century, with Maldivian fishermen occasionally visiting the islands. It wouldn't be settled until the late 18th century, when the French began setting up coconut plantations in the area. However, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the British were given control of the territory, with the territory being administratively linked with the British-controlled island of Mauritius. The island was mostly made up of a mix of slaves originating from Mozambique, Madagascar, and other Eastern African countries. They would be freed in 1840, but many would still continue to work in the coconut plantations and form their own distinctive culture. Today, these former slaves are known as the Gibraltarians. In the 1960s, change would come to the archipelago. The British had separated the islands from Mauritius administratively, and began removing the native Gibraltarians from their homes. They expelled the islanders so they could build a U.S. military base in the area, so the U.S. could have a base in the Indian Ocean to combat Soviet influence. The base would be fully built and the islanders fully expelled by 1973. Most of the islanders would end up settling in either England or Mauritius. Today the island is still used as a military base, with a little under 5,000 people living on the island. The base serves as a refueling station, communication array, and port for U.S. ships in the region. A small number of British troops and other U.S. allied troops are also stationed in the area. The base is, if you couldn't guess by the explosion, very controversial. Today, the remaining Chagosians intensely campaign for the islands to be returned to them, and the base to be removed, so they can settle in their traditional homes. The government of Mauritius claims the islands as their own, frequently engaging in diplomatic squawks with the British government over the islands. The Maldives also argues that part of the maritime territory of the British Indian Ocean Territory should belong to them. This has all led to the British and Mauritius government frequently going to international court over the matter. In 2020, the UN declared that the islands belong to Mauritius. But both America and Britain have both rejected this decision, and the base remains for the time being. So now we will finally go to the Pitcairn Islands in the South Pacific. The islands are fairly isolated, although French Polynesia is west of it, and if you go far enough east, you'll hit Easter Island. The Pitcairn Islands are made up of 4 islands, with only one, Pitcairn Island, being inhabited. The islands are the smallest dependency population-wise in the world, with only 40-some people living on Pitcairn Island. The islands are believed to have been settled by Polynesian explorers and traders during the late Middle Ages, where they would build up a settlement on Pitcairn and Henderson Island, although by the 1600s the population would be wiped out due to limited natural resources. The islands would remain unsettled until 1790. The HMS Bounty, a British naval ship, saw the crew of the ship mutiny against their captain, with many of the men on the ship ending up all across the Pacific. 9 of the mutineers, along with 6 men and 11 women from the Polynesian island of Tahiti, sailed to Pitcairn Island, hoping to create a new life on the isolated island. They burned the ship and began creating a new society where, initially, things were very peaceful. These original colonists would set up one town and capital on the island, Adamstown. However, as time went by, tension began to mount. The European men dominated this new society, with the Polynesian men only allowed to sleep with one woman. The Polynesians were treated less like actual people and more like property. Eventually, these tensions between the European and Polynesian men led to a series of murders that would end with only one European, John Adams, and 9 women and their children alive by 1800. The women, it should be noted, were treated by both groups not very well. They were essentially considered sexual objects by the men, and at one point all of them attempted to leave the island. Adams would, at some point in the early 1800s, undergo a dramatic change, becoming the spiritual head of the island, and the conditions for the remaining people on the island improved. At several points, several different ships would come and visit the island, but it wouldn't be until 1814 when the islanders were reconnected with the outside world. The island community would slowly begin to grow, and a more conservative and reserved society was created on the island. With the population growth, there was some concern that the island wouldn't be able to hold the expanding population. In 1831, the entire population left to live on Tahiti after being invited, but they felt uncomfortable in this new society, and disease led to several deaths. They would return home to Pitcairn later that year. In 1856, the question of leaving the island would again come up, and almost the entire population would leave to settle on Norfolk Island. While most would like their new home, several would return back to Pitcairn several years later. The islanders did create a constitution in 1838 that gave women the right to vote, making it one of the first areas in the world where women's suffrage was allowed. The constitution is also when the islands are considered to have been annexed into the British Empire. Many islanders would convert to Seventh-day Adventism in the late 19th century, and limited immigration will be allowed in, with the island reaching its population peak in 1937, with 223 people on the island. Many, however, would start to leave the island looking for work, as the economy was fairly slow and jobs were limited. The island's economy today is dominated by tourism and agriculture. Life will be shaken on the island in 2004. 9 men on the island, or in other words, almost 14% of the entire island's population, was convicted of sexual assault offenses involving children. Due to the fact that Pitcairn was so isolated from much of its history, was male-dominated, and what the legal age of consent was seemingly had an unclear status, this all led to most women on the island having sex and kids when they were somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. This created a culture where the majority of people on the island defended this pedophilic practice, and it was just accepted that older men having sex with very young girls was okay and good for them. When British authorities tried to step in, some islanders even claimed that it was a part of a wider conspiracy to arrest all the men on the island. It seems like the island is trying to change for the better, and British authorities are trying to do more to crack down on this practice, but even then, many of the men who were convicted of these sexual assault offenses got off with very, very light charges, and what the long-term effects of this all are remain to be seen. Pitcairn is currently suffering a population decline. More and more people have left the island over the years, looking for jobs in better places, and few want to move to the island, either because they heard about the 2004 trial, or they heard that there are essentially no jobs on the island. The requirements of moving to the island are very high, and with the rapidly aging population, it seems like the population will continue to decline unless something is done very quickly. So why aren't these places countries and remain territories under the British Crown? Well, with the Pitcairn Islands, it is just quite frankly too small to become independent. It relies on Britain for vital supplies, and with its declining population and small territory, it seems unlikely independence could ever happen. With the remaining 3 territories, it is a different story. These territories hold a large degree of strategic importance for Britain and its allies. These are areas the British, quite frankly, are not willing to give up. Giving up these territories would lead to a weaker Britain. Gibraltar probably has the best shot of self-determination due to the fact that it has a sizable population living there, but I seriously doubt the British will willingly and happily give up its bases on Cyprus or the British Indian Ocean Territory anytime soon. So thank you all for watching. This was my last video in my series on the British overseas territories. It's so crazy to think that Britain still has these far-off, kind of quasi-colonies or territories. Although Britain isn't unique in that regard, there are a whole bunch of countries that have these. I talked about Australia's external territories, which includes Norfolk Island, that I mentioned in this episode. If you want to watch that, I'll put a link in the description. So after this, I'll talk about the history of Belize, and then I'll work on Rex's request for Dutch political parties. I'll probably break that up into 2 videos, one with all the major parties, and then one with some of the smaller parties. But thank you for watching this video. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.